My name is Afua Hoy, and together with Aminat Ali, who's in front, we are your conference co-chairs for the 20th Annual Africa Business Conference. So 20 years is obviously a very big deal, at least we think so. And so to do that, though, we wanted to acknowledge and celebrate the founders of the conference and the club. And they couldn't be here with us, but we have Ndidi, Alkan, and Fola, who started this 20 years ago, and it still keeps going somehow. And so as we thought of the theme, values and value chains, Africa in a new global era, one of the things we wanted to do was we thought it was time to situate the conversation in a global sphere and think about not only what Africa is doing within, but all the ways that the continent, individuals, and businesses can engage with the global world. After all, I mean, it might not feel that way, but we are still in a globalized village. And so the keynotes we chose, the panelists, the themes we have is all trying to get that message across. And so without further ado, I want to introduce the people on stage with me. First, we'll have Professor Elkins, who is a Harvard Business School professor and a Harvard University professor of African and African American history, and she will be moderating the Q&A session. And then we have, to my very left, we have Razia Khan. She is a chief economist at Standard Chartered, and she will sort of be setting the stage and talking about how African economies are shaping compared to the rest of the world. So that'll be a very insightful conversation. And then we'll move over to Kareem Senhaji, who is CEO of OCP Africa. And OCP is one of the largest phosphate producers in the world. So that'll be very interesting to hear their perspective on how that business, which is obviously based in Morocco, so an African business, is interacting with the rest of the world. And then we'll head it off with MD Ramesh from Olam International. He's the president of the South and Southern Africa part of Olam's business. And Olam is pretty much an agribusiness tycoon, so they will be talking about how they are engaging the value chains and the values all the way to the end consumer. And what's very interesting about that is Olam is not an African-based company, so that perspective, again, always bringing it back to the global, always tying it back to how Africa can engage with the rest of the world. So with that, I will have Razia, who will come up and start off the discussion. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is the 20th anniversary of the conference. Come on, give it up for it. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning, and before we get started, I think that we also need to give it just an enormous round of applause to the students who have put this together. This is the largest conference on Africa business in the world. It is every year. This is the 20th year, and I think it is a testament to the kinds of dedication, the hard work, the tireless efforts behind the scenes, and I could not be more proud to be moderating the first session and more proud to say thank all of you, and let's give it up for them. So the format this morning is we'll have each of our speakers, Razia first, speaking for about 15 minutes, and then I will try to do some magic and pull out some common threads and have a conversation together here as a panel, and then we'll open up for a few questions, and we'll wrap up at about 10:15 or so. Please, Razia.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. 15 minutes for the outlook for Africa. That's some ambition. So let's start with where we are in terms of global growth and the growth optimism that is slowly, we think, but gradually returning to the region itself. About 10 years ago, there was a great deal more enthusiasm about the performance of African economies. The narrative, which traditionally had been very pessimistic, had swung around completely. By around 2007, 2008, just on the eve of the global financial crisis, we had seen that faster performance, the growth outperformance from Africa, being demonstrated, although it was for a very short period of time. A lot of the time, people were focusing on the more beneficial global backdrop that had driven this performance. We had seen from 2001, China's accession to the WTO, voracious demand for commodities being produced in Africa out of China, a gradual lifting to global growth everywhere. Emerging markets generally were doing much better. and many African economies came into their own. We should say that as much as the temptation is to look at African growth in terms of what has happened to commodity prices, for us, certainly an institution like Standard Chartered that has been present in the region for over 150 years, it would be wrong to think of African growth as being about commodities alone. Now, I know in the wake of the collapse of commodity prices, the collapse of oil prices, certainly from late 2014, this sounds like something of a controversial statement to be making. Because if you're not paying very careful attention, it looks as though Africa did well when commodity prices were strong, did less well when commodity prices were weaker, and now we're seeing the benefits of global growth that should provide that lift once again to external prospects. And isn't that key to the turnaround story? Maybe not. First of all, let's put the recent pessimism about the region in context. We know that from around 2001 up until the global financial crisis, we were seeing the growth outperformance from Africa. In general, something happened, especially if we looked at sub-Saharan Africa, we started to see a faster average growth rate than that of much of the world. From the post-crisis period, we did see only a very shallow dip in growth. If we looked at 2009, we were still seeing Africa being somewhat less impacted than a lot of the rest of the world in terms of the effect, the negative impact of the crisis, and growth came back relatively quickly. Why was this? Accommodative policy everywhere. It made it easier for many African sovereigns to borrow in international capital markets, to upscale the size of their borrowing, to keep infrastructure programs going. And growth of sorts did come back, but it was never that robust. And in 2016, we saw the weakest growth average that we had seen since the global financial crisis. A few points to recognize about this. A lot of that was simply the averages. The two largest economies in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria and South Africa, saw a significant deceleration in growth. For Nigeria, it was an outright contraction. And those two economies alone make up over 50% of sub-Saharan African growth. So if they were underperforming, the suggestion was that in terms of the growth, the GDP-weighted average, we were going to see a much lower rate. But that didn't mean that across East Africa, for some of the Francophone African commodity importing countries like Cote d'Ivoire, like Senegal, we didn't see a much better growth rate. The story of Africa, as many of you know, isn't ever uniform. It's very difficult to talk about a single growth trend applying to everyone. Where are we today? We know that oil prices have come back to a certain extent. Maybe we are never going back to those days of triple-digit oil prices, but an economy like Nigeria will benefit from the fact that oil output has recovered significantly. We still think that there hasn't been sufficient evidence of economic reform, and we're looking at a fairly muted growth rate from one of the larger economies, maybe 3% in 2018. For South Africa, it's very difficult to ignore the wave of optimism that is sweeping over that country, given recent political changes in South Africa. There's an expectation that consumer confidence, that investor confidence are going to be turning around, and that this will drive growth. Everyone has become very used to the fact that in the recent past, growth was probably capped at a sub 2% level. In the very recent past, maybe even sub 1%. But we think that there are enough building blocks in place to be able to see an improved performance. And for much of the rest of the region, we shouldn't forget that important lag. Right now, we are in a special place in terms of the global economy. Most of the key regions globally are growing. In 2017, we saw the first year-on-year acceleration in Chinese growth, again since the global financial crisis. The US economy is doing well, outperforming expectations to some extent. Europe, the survey data has finally turned into more robust GDP data, and this is a good place to be. Suddenly, the growth enthusiasm has returned to Africa. But what are the threats, and what do we know about what it takes to actually get the structural transformation? I've spoken about the path in terms of growth. We saw very strong expectations pre-crisis, the Africa Rising narrative. The building blocks for that were supposed to be very firm. We saw a very robust rate of demographic growth. The structure of Africa's population was changing. The share of the working age in the total population was starting to be that much larger. If we look back in time, it was not dissimilar to what we had seen in Asian economies in the 1970s, when we started to see outperformance there. We know that Africa has a very high rate of urbanization. This should mean people moving from lower value added activities to higher value added activities. You would expect to see productivity gains. There had been evidence of a growing middle class. We do believe that the income growth was for real, in line with the productivity improvements, much more spending on infrastructure, allowing for faster growth, the adoption of new technology. All of these were supposed to have been longer-term structural drivers of African growth. And each of these factors is still in place. But why are we now seeing only a very guarded optimism in terms of the growth that might be likely? Because we know that Africa once again has been tested by a commodity cycle. And we know from the experience of individual economies that growth doesn't always happen in a straight line. We have to look at the region's banking sectors, the arrears that we had seen building up from a number of governments. How quickly are those going to be resolved? How quickly can the private sector lending come back? What are the growth possibilities? We do know that Africa generally follows global growth with something of a lag. So the expectation is, yes, all the good news that we're seeing everywhere else is eventually going to be feeding back into a better growth profile. What are the risks? Very quickly, there was a lot of borrowing that had been done. Global conditions were accommodative in the post-crisis period, very low interest rates globally, and many African sovereigns, we've seen a slew of external issuance just in the last few weeks alone, were using that environment to be building up their external debt commitments to spend on infrastructure. Growth kept going even in the absence of that strong commodities-driven boost, because that infrastructure spending, which is necessary to the transformation, was taking place. But when we fast forward 10 years on from QE, there are some problems emerging. We're going to see the concentration of external debt maturities. Suddenly, a lot more of this borrowing that had been taken on needs to be repaid. And the question is, are we going to see a smooth set of circumstances? For many of the sovereigns that have in the recent past been extending their debt maturities, have been coming back to the market, borrowing 15 years or for greater maturities, they should be okay. They can comfortably refinance their debt. For other countries that need to prove that they are strong reformers to keep the confidence of investors, it may not be that easy. If we're tested by a significant tightening of global financial conditions, the sustainability of African growth is something that we will still need to focus on. So what we're essentially saying is this. There have been many different thoughts about what was driving African growth. The longer-term fundamentals had something to do with it. When investors look at Africa, it is that demographic boost, it is the pace of change. These are the compelling factors. This is a region that you would expect to see growing. But we also know that the ability of individual economies to weather external shocks isn't necessarily always that robust. We know that some of those external challenges may be deepening. Are we going to see the continued growth and transformation of African economies, or are we going to see the stop-start? I will end the comments very briefly with a comparison of Africa and Asia. What made things different in terms of the different trajectories that we've seen in the different regions? In Africa, we know that a lot more of the growth was domestically driven. It had to do with the emergence of the consumer. We can't separate that out from the experience of democratization after the 1990s, more of an embrace in more countries of multi-party democracy, and opening up of the space for civil society and the private sector, and the demand from electorates for better economic policy making, the stabilization of inflation rates that we started to see, more effective financial intermediation. What we didn't see, though, was this big boost in terms of a sustained improvement in external performance. And this is where the challenge is. Pre-crisis, we saw investment and savings rates across Africa rising. Post-crisis, investment continued to increase. That isn't necessarily backed up by the sustained improvement in savings. There's a problem. African economies are going to be vulnerable to external shocks and to any tightening of global financial conditions. The other issue is just the sustainability of growth. We know that for economies that have seen transformation, proper structural transformation, not just the stop-start of a few years of good growth for it to be replaced by somewhat more challenging circumstances. It's the ability to sustain 7% type growth rates that ultimately does matter. And this is the challenge. For as long as we see external conditions being a key driver of what does ultimately happen in African economies, there are going to be question marks about whether we see that sustained growth performance allowing the transformation to happen. We are still encouraged. There's no taking away the long-term drivers, the economic fundamentals of the region. The demographics alone suggest that this is a region that's too important to ignore. But we also need to be realistic about the challenges and the ability to weather the external shocks. So to conclude on the outlook for African economies, global growth is back, the outlook is favorable. Let's not make the mistake of taking the growth for granted. There needs to be much more of a focus on rebuilding the resilience that will allow these economies to weather the external shocks. Thank you.